Akkam jirtu. Ani Eebbisaa Raggaasaati, Waldaa Oromoo Qoronnoorraayi. My name is Dr. Eebbisaa Raggaasa. I'm the president of Oromo Studies Association. Today, we are continuing on Oromo's OSA's conversation with the scholars series. And today we have a distinguished guest, Professor Alex Waal of Tufts University, an executive director of World Peace Foundation. He is an expert on the Horn of Africa. He has extensively studied the Horn of Africa countries. He has written several influential, great books. Today we have him on to discuss what is next for Ethiopia, which is an article titled by him. We'll be focusing primarily on that. We also invited Professor Mekuria Bulcha, who has been, due to technical difficulties, not able to join us at this moment. Maybe he'll join us later on down the road. And as I said, I'm the OSA president. I've been elected to serve and to primarily this year focus on the fundamental, the ideological problem, the theoretical framework of Ethiopia and the regional problem of the Horn of Africa. We, as Oromo Studies Association, we were very much interested in Alex Waal's article, What's Next, because it raised some fundamental questions that is fresh and unique to us. First, as someone who studies northern Ethiopia, he was able to now look and bring a broader light to the entire Ethiopia and look at the problem from fundamental point of view. And so that really piqued our interest. And today we're with him to examine and to consider some of the problem that is occurring throughout Ethiopia's history. And so it's my pleasure for me to welcome him to the stage. But some of the main questions that we try to, in this conversation, we try to get across is what is next for Ethiopia? Why is Ethiopia at war with itself? These are some basic questions. We'll be discussing the multinational federalism, its role, and the regional problem, and the war on Tigray, its implications, whether it was avoidable, and the international community's response. Now, I think it's important to give a brief overview of what had occurred in Ethiopia, and that is after 27 years of EPRDF rule, Prime Minister Abiy came to power on the back of youth democratic protest, locally known as the Cairo protest or the Oromo protest, that brought him into power. And he promised to transition the country toward a democratic governance, and that transition has stalled. And today Ethiopia is engulfed in greater war, and Ethiopia also have lost its relationship with the United States and other international countries. And in fact, recently, the United States have removed Ethiopia from AGWA. It's a very important economic benefit that Ethiopia gains from. So we have international relations that have been severed, democratic transition that has been stalled, war in every front is occurring in the country. And so today we are here to discuss with Alex Waal, who's an expert. And I want to start with a direct question to him. What are some reasons Ethiopia had continued to exist in this failed state or unable to achieve democracy? After many attempts, after many struggles, Ethiopia had failed to achieve democracy, and now we find ourselves on the verge of catastrophe.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you, and Happy New Year to you and to everyone who's joining us. And let us really hope that 2022 in our Western calendar, at least, is a year of peace and democratization, because Ethiopians desperately, of course, need that. After successive governments that have failed to democratize, and the current state of real existential crisis facing the nation of nations that is Ethiopia. So you posed a question: why has Ethiopia failed to democratize? And of course, if we look at every successive regime, there is a different explanation. Ethiopia was an empire. It was an indigenous African empire in which the emperors of Ethiopia participated as junior partners in the European scramble for Africa. And it's deeply ironic when we hear some of the anti-imperialist rhetoric coming out of Addis Ababa at the moment to reflect that actually those who are propagating it are against empires, but not their own empire. They would really, there are many of them actually dreaming of reconstituting an indigenous land-based empire, not dissimilar to the Russian Empire or the Ottoman Empire, with its own ethnic hierarchy, with them at the top, with Ethiopianness made to be identified with a certain set of cultural, linguistic, and other characteristics. Under the military regime, of course, of Mengistu Haile Mariam, it was a communist military dictatorship. Under the EPRDF of Meles Zenawi, it was a developmental security state. And in my book, The Real Politics of the Horn of Africa, my chapter on Ethiopia really consists of my debates with Meles around this and other issues. And the point at which I come down on Meles's theory of democracy was, his theory was democracy not yet. His approach to democratization was, let us postpone it until Ethiopia achieves a middle income status. And I think there is actually a serious debate to be had about the sequencing of economic development and democratization. And the democracy that we have seen over the last, or democratization efforts that we've seen over the last few years, I think have been fundamentally flawed. And one of the issues we see there is that in Ethiopia, the generations that ruled Ethiopia until Abiy came along, and in fact, even many of those who are in power now, are of the generation of the student radicals.
Right.
And among that generation, the tradition of a sort of civic republicanism was very weak. Many of those who espoused democracy, you scratch them, and underneath they are actually ethnic chauvinists. They actually believed that democratization should consist in the triumph of their socio-cultural values. It was a democracy that shaded into a resuscitation of the empire. And that, of course, is not sustainable. And the democracy movement that brought Abiy to power was then shut down by Abiy, as we know. And those who led it, who participated in it, who espoused the values of a sort of a middle way of retaining the aspirations of the ethno-federalist system and democratizing them, which was the great failure of the EPRDF. It maintained the system, but did not democratize it. Those people were then shut out of politics, and some of them, as we speak, are now being released from jail, but they're being released from jail into a very different political environment in which we really don't know what freedom and power they will have.
Great, that's wonderful. Let me ask you on this. When you had a debate with Meles about whether democracy should proceed first or economic development, had he chosen the opposite step, democratize Ethiopia first, then economic development next, would things have been totally different than the reality we would see today?
Well, part of the debate that is so necessary is exactly what is Ethiopia's own particular path to democratization. And what we've seen around Africa and the greater Middle East is that very often the pattern that occurs, the trajectory that occurs when an authoritarian system is liberalized, is not a shift to democracy, but a shift from what I would call, in my scholarship, a tightly regulated political market, an authoritarian political market, to a deregulated political market, in which it's not freedom of expression, it's not the ability to convince constituencies of your point of view or your program, it's not democracy in that civil sense that flourishes. What flourishes is buying and selling political services and loyalties according to the rules of the market.
Right.
And this is what, for example, we've seen in Sudan, and then taken to an extreme, we see in countries like Libya, countries like, my apologies, in countries like Yemen, countries like Syria, countries like Libya, a very deregulated political market. And I think what we saw in the first year or so, year and a half of Abiy Ahmed's premiership, was Ethiopia going down that road. So potentially it was going down a road where it could look like the sort of the quasi-democratic, quasi-authoritarian political system that we see in a country like Nigeria. And I think some of the affinity that Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has with former President Olusegun Obasanjo is the fact, not only the fact that they're fellow Pentecostalists, but they have a similar transactional approach to dealing with political life. Where this diverged into a very different sort of path was the entry of Eritrea, because the politics of Isaias Afwerki are the politics of extermination. We know how he has treated the democratic forces in his country. We know what he did to all his comrades who petitioned him for a democratic opening some 20 plus years ago. We have not seen them since. They have literally disappeared. We have a country without a constitution, without rule of law, just purely the personal property of the dictator. And Isaias, when he talks about crushing or exterminating his enemies, means it literally. And so the fact that Prime Minister Abiy was ready to enter into a relationship, a political relationship with Isaias Afwerki, in which he was the junior partner,
right,
and wage a war against Tigray, turned that from a troubled trajectory of democratization to a war of extermination against Tigray, and that, I think, was a fatal step for Ethiopia and for the region.
Thank you. And in fact, many are saying that, especially the last 2 or 3 years of Abiy's administration, looks like more of an Eritrean administration. The fact that first they attacked his freedom, the press, imprisoning critical voices, and the fact now that Eritrea, Isaias Afwerki has been calling for this. He was against the multinational federalism. He was calling for changing the constitution, and we see this step by step at play right now, including the war on Tigray. Now, had he not been partnered with Isaias, would we see the current war or the current instability in Ethiopia at this level?
I think absolutely not. I think that Isaias Afwerki back in the 1990s, and she's speaking to me when I was in engaging with him back in those days, he said Ethiopia will go the way of Yugoslavia. He described it in 1997 after the collapse of the Mobutu regime in Zaire. He said Ethiopia is just an overdressed Zaire. And he didn't mean that simply as a description. He meant that as his own political project. His vision for the region was that Ethiopia would be weak and fragmented, and sitting on top of it, extracting its resources, would be Eritrea. Eritrea would be the one that would profit from the disorder, in Ethiopia, would extract its natural resources, its human resources, etc., and would be the beneficiary. And this is what he's really wanted all along. And the two great threats that he faced in Ethiopia, well, one was the TPLF, and the other was the Ethiopian National Defense Forces. And if he could get the two to destroy each other, then he would be happy. And that is exactly what Abiy allowed him to do. And the TPLF too. The TPLF are not innocent. They were extremely arrogant, not only in the way that they managed Ethiopia, but also the way in which they felt themselves to be invulnerable, that they could not be weakened in any way.
Right. That invisibility of
both Isaias and Abiy, come and get us, and of course, they proved they were able to resist, but at a terrible price.
Also, we piggyback on that. We are now seeing the anti-Western campaign and sentiment in Ethiopia. In fact, the recent campaign, which is, as you mentioned earlier, shameful, that this Pan-Africanism and that it's Ethiopian sovereignty in trying to prevent the West from intervening on the basis of humanitarian crisis is actually emerging. We have seen rallies. We have seen inside the country and outside the country championing or allying with Isaias Afwerki and other dictators around the globe. And the United States have been the greatest ally of Ethiopia for a very, very long time. Do you suppose the sudden turn against the United States, the Western values, emanates from Isaias and Abiy joining together?
I think it's, I mean, first of all, I must preface this by pointing out that in my in my career as an academic and an activist, I've opposed every single US military intervention. I resigned in 1992. I resigned from Human Rights Watch, opposing the intervention in Somalia. I opposed the NATO intervention in Libya. I've opposed the interventions in Syria and in Afghanistan too, actually, as well as being opposed to the Iraq War. So and I've worked. My close colleague, Justice Africa, was the former, the late lamented Tajuddin Abdurrahim, the Secretary General of the Pan-Africanist movement. So I come from that particular background of being utterly anti-imperialist, and I was part of the group that supported the reform of the OAU to create the African Union some 20 or so years ago, on the basis that the OAU had achieved its historic mission of ridding the continent of colonial and racist rule. But the failures of African government and leadership were inviting in neo-imperial intervention, as in Somalia, for example.
Right.
And it was therefore necessary for the Africans to adopt norms, principles, and set up institutions to stop this from happening again. And we see those norms, principles, and institutions in the Constitutive Act of the African Union. And what is and key to those is the notion of sovereignty as responsibility. A government, a state, is sovereign insofar as it is responsible to its citizens. And it was the African Union that came up with the doctrine of non-indifference, that when there were grave circumstances, war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and that includes starvation crimes, which are these sorts of crimes, then there had to be intervention. Political, first of all, but if necessary, military. I'm, as I said, against military intervention. I don't think it works, but there has to be political intervention. And that is the foundational principle, one of the foundational principles of the African Union. And Isaias Afwerki is utterly against that. He has done his best to undermine it.
He's against AU intervening.
He's against the AU as an institution. and he's against those principles in the Constitutive Act.
Mm-hmm.
And Abiy followed him down that road. And what we see is the dismantling of this African peace and security architecture, of which Ethiopia was a proud member and a pillar. I mean, its peacekeepers were deployed, its diplomats were deployed. It had a very, very well-renowned diplomatic service, completely dismantled by Abiy. It's inconceivable that Ethiopian peacekeepers will be allowed on UN missions because they now have a deplorable human rights record. They actually had a good human rights record before. And what we are seeing is actually the Ethiopia led by Isaias. Isaias is sort of leading Ethiopia by the nose, is becoming part of the greater Middle East. So that the politics, the regional politics that determine what happens in Ethiopia are not the politics of Africa. They are the politics of the Middle East, of Turkey, UAE, of Iran, and backing them in the background, Russia and China too. And it is ironic that a government that is going begging to Turkey, to the UAE, to Russia to get mercenaries, and is becoming dependent upon these powers, then turns around to the United States and says, you're an imperial power. What did the United States do? I'm no defender of the United States, but it did nothing in this particular...
It's a little bit disingenuous, isn't it?
It's totally disingenuous. And what they are now realizing today, of course, is that the country is now bankrupt. And it is bankrupt because of these policies and this needless war. And because of the way that Eritrea is parasitic on the most productive sectors of the economy, it is being drained, the blood is being sucked out of Ethiopia to profit Eritrea. And the UAE and Turkey, etc., will sell weapons, and they will provide money to prop up the government. There was a recent article, I'm sure you read it, by General Tzadkan Gebretinsai of the Tigrayan Defense Force in The Elephant, in which he called it a government in name only. And there is no longer a state. There is a government, but there's no state. Just like in Libya, there's a government but no state. In Yemen, there's a government but no state. In Syria, there's a little bit of a state. And so what we are seeing is Ethiopia following that trajectory. But because Ethiopia needs money, it is now going to come begging back to the Western. It's going to come back to the Western countries because it knows that the Turks, the Emiratis, the Chinese, the Russians are not going to foot the bill for reconstructing that developmental project, for paying for health, education, and welfare, and humanitarian aid. It's Europe and America that will do it. And it's, I mean, Meles Zenawi used to say to criticize his opponents for jingoism on an empty belly, and that is exactly sums up
what's going on. I think, in fact, to support your view, I think the last article I saw that Ethiopian economy going down, Eritrean economy was actually growing because of this war. Somehow, someway, Eritrea was doing better in terms of economy than Ethiopia. And piggyback on what you said, in fact, there is an active lobbying by the Ethiopian government trying to reinstate the AGWA, African Growth and Opportunity Act, while at the same time calling the United States an imperialist country. So this type of duplicitous act is dangerous. It's hurting the relationship between our country, in fact, the people of Ethiopia, who are suffering the greatest at this point. I just want to ask a quick question. What the Middle Eastern countries, what is their interest in Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa? Is it economic? Is it allies that they're seeking? Is it a strategic geographical location? What do we attribute to their involvement with Isaias, with Ethiopia, and the rest of this?
There's a deep irony here, which is that Ethiopia has long seen Egypt as its strategic rival and adversary for all the reasons we know, to do with the River Nile, to do with Egypt wanting to keep Ethiopia weak and divided. the main Arab countries, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates in particular, given the choice, they will always go with Egypt. Their allegiances, their affinity is always going to be to Cairo, not to Addis Ababa. And the idea that you would have these Middle Eastern countries essentially having a controlling stake in the politics of Ethiopia, which is what they have today, and not following an Egyptian agenda is unthinkable. Of course, they are following an Egyptian agenda. That is plain to everybody who knows anything about the politics of the Middle East. And the fact that Abiy would essentially surrender the autonomy of Ethiopia to Middle Eastern countries that do not have the interests of Ethiopia is extreme. Now, what are the particular interests then? And I think there's security interests, and then there's resource and economic interests. They essentially see all those countries, and I think Israel is now part, after the Abraham Accords, is part of the mix too. They see the Horn of Africa as a whole as part of their strategic perimeter, an area which needs to be controlled by them in order to ensure that overall strategy. They want their overall security, I should say. Part of their theater of influence, if you like. And so under the Trump administration, Egypt, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the Emirates were essentially given the power by the US. You run this region on our behalf. The Biden administration tried to pull that back, but not very far. Really, faced with the lobbying power and clout of those countries and the money of Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, what we see is those countries are ready to push back against the US. Say, no, you do what you want. We're the ones in charge here, and we're going to stay that way. And so first of all, they have security interests, and then they have economic interests. They see resources. They see farmland. These are places that know that with climate crisis, global warming, they are going to need access to the plentiful resources of the Nile basin, of the Ethiopian highlands, and this is the way that they're getting control of that.
Absolutely, and I think the Ethiopian people need to seriously examine the working of this and the relationship with Isaias, and call a transparent approach to democracy. Now, let me switch gear and ask you that whether this war was necessary, the Tigray war. Could it have been avoidable? Was there a different path? Or this was predetermined? Because the way we see it coming, especially the Oromo Studies Association, where the minute Prime Minister Abiy came, the first thing they came after is the democratic movement, the grassroots democratic movement in the country. And then there was some kind of Cold War that was declared in the Oromia region. Once they weakened, dismantled that, then they went on to the north. And many scholars think the war on Tigray is actually a continuation of the war from Oromia to the north. Now, was it necessary? Was there a different solution? Was there something that could have been done on either side to avoid this war?
I think there are really 3 points to make. The first is that, yes, it was clear that from fairly early on, Abiy wanted to consolidate power, and he overpromised. In those first months, he promised everything to everybody. And the nature of a politician who does that is you can't trust him. He's going to have to start disappointing some of his constituencies, because you cannot deliver everything to everybody. And the people he will disappoint will be those who are less, the ones who are weakest, less able to have real leverage. And so he began by disappointing the Oromans.
Right.
And I don't think that the war with Tigray was an inevitable outcome of his confrontation with the Oromans. I think some political confrontation definitely and some tough political bargaining was necessary. I think what turned it into a war was two things. One was the alliance with Eritrea that wanted a war. And Eritrea, or Isaias Afwerki, wanted a war against Tigray. He didn't care so much about the Oromos. He just wanted to destroy Tigray out of vengeance and hatred. And then also the miscalculations on both sides, the errors and miscalculations on both sides. The TPLF leadership basically seemed to welcome the war and was, I think, highly irresponsible in ratcheting up the political pressure. But the fundamental responsibility for the war at the end of the day goes to whoever was in charge of the federal government as the most powerful player, and that was Abiy, especially given his self-developed image as a peacemaker. But then there's a separate question, which is that if you have a war, there are different ways of fighting a war. You can actually fight a war to get your opponent, your adversary, to submit, or you can fight a war against the people, a war of extermination. And it was a choice jointly made by Abiy, by Isaias, and by some in the Amhara region to make it a war of extermination. And that was one-sided. That was a purely one-sided decision. And over the months, I was very reluctant to use the word genocide, both because we didn't, in my view, have real proof of genocidal intent and genocide and acts constitutive of genocide, and also I didn't think it was helpful. I changed my mind on the basis of the evidence that came out, not on the basis of that extraordinarily venomous public rhetoric coming out of individuals close to Abiy, which is undoubtedly genocide. There is, the crime of genocide has been committed and may well still be being committed, not least by inflicting starvation of the scale and nature that is being done today.
Now, I mean, I absolutely agree with you. This is a war against civilian, not against militia or armed groups, because the siege, basically the Tigray state is disconnected from the world as we speak right now. They have no access to international borders. There is no communication in or out. There is no market that the people could go and exchange goods. And on all three corners, on the west side, you have the Amhara militia preventing them from reaching Sudan. On the north, you have the Eritrean. On the eastern side, you have the Ethiopian military. And so this is a dire situation. Is there an option for the international community to act urgently, at least to allow humanitarian access to the Tigray region? And let me also, why was the UN ineffective in trying to at least focus on the humanitarian, twist the Ethiopian government's arm to allow to resolve this conflict? Where is the problem? Ideologically, why has the UN failed to take a lead on this conflict?
I wish I could give you an answer. I think it's absolutely shocking, the inaction of it's absolutely shocking, the inaction of the United Nations, of course the African Union too, and of major Western countries in over what is a entirely man-made, and we know the men who made it, famine. And the fact that we don't have the pictures, the fact that we don't have humanitarian organizations able to provide the data about what is happening makes it even more shocking that there isn't an outcry. If you listen to the UN, if you listen to the news broadcast, they'll say 400,000 people facing famine. Well, that figure was from June, and virtually no food has gone in since June, very little food has been grown in Tigray. If there were 400,000 people facing famine in June, they will have died.
Right.
Those children will have died.
Mm-hmm.
And if we look at the data and the analysis provided by the UN's own famine review committee, what we will see is that their prognostication was that widespread famine would have been happening by the end of September or October. Now, the modest harvest will have come in November and December. And so the deterioration may have halted, may have plateaued. But if the situation is not addressed in the coming months, it is just going to get worse and worse. And there are historical cases. I've written a book on I have here, mass starvation, the history of basically the history of man-made famine. And there are cases in history where governments have created famine and killed millions of people. The worst case is Mao Zedong in China in the late 1950s, but also Pol Pot in Cambodia in the 70s. And these famines only came to light after they left office, because people were not able to go and get the data, and because people were unable to leave those places. And we could be seeing the same today. We could be in a situation where, when we are able to get the information, we find out 100,000, 200,000 children have starved to death, and we did nothing about it. And that is absolutely shocking and scandalous. But let me say one more thing about this, which is that for all the problems of the EPRDF government, one of the things that it actually did was it overcame famine in Ethiopia. Ethiopia was, infamously, shamefully the land of famine. And I'm sure that Ethiopians of
I remember as a kid,
felt ashamed to see these pictures coming out. And when you came to the United States and Europe, and people thought, you're an Ethiopian and you're not starving, what's going on? We're going back to those days. And it was, one of the achievements, including of people who are currently in government, like Democratize, was part of the group that actually very effectively prevented famine in occurring after the drought of 2015, 2016. They know how to do it. They deliberately didn't, because the ethos of the Prosperity Party, and it's a very deeply ironic name in these circumstances, is that prosperity is something that does not come through public policy. Prosperity is something that comes through your personal characteristics, your relationship with your creator, and what comes from that, your work as an individual. And in this type of combination of Pentecostal faith, this version of Pentecostalism that sweeps away the need for public policy to care for people, alongside this highly transactional zero-sum approach to politics, means it's perfectly okay to reduce a whole province, a district, a town, a province, to a state of misery in order to pursue a political objective. And I find that deeply shocking and disturbing. Not only will we see that in Tigray, we will see that in other parts of Ethiopia as well.
Absolutely, and I think you're right. Christianity was born in the West and died in Ethiopia because the fundamental ethics of Christianity is to help the poor, feed the poor, and without having that basic Christian ethics, I don't know how you could become a Christian in light of what we are seeing, what's going on in the country. Given all this, what is happening, what do you envision the Tigray state to be? Do you see it to be somehow, some way remaining with Ethiopia, or do you see a scenario where Tigray become an independent state, or some different form of political integration? If it is the route of the public frustration that I'm seeing now among the Tigrayans, is some are they feel abandoned by Ethiopia, and they, they're entertaining the idea of maybe forming their own independent country. Do you foresee that? If so, what has to be in place? What has to change in either scenario where Tigray remains with Ethiopia or Tigray becomes an independent state?
I think the most important thing at the moment is to extend that hand of understanding, sympathy, and solidarity to the people of Tigray, because they have been facing a war of extermination for some 14 months now, without any external assistance whatsoever. I mean, there's all this nonsense coming, that the Americans are conspiring with them. Well, there is no evidence for that. Everything that we have seen is that the Tigrayans are entirely on their own, and that promises that were made that the world will act, to prevent the famine, to prevent the massacres, to make sure there is no impunity for the atrocities committed. All those promises have been broken, and there's no justification for the abuses that were committed by the Tigrayan troops in Amhara and Afar, but there is an explanation, and the explanation is that they had been told that their lives didn't matter, that the abuses that they had suffered, that they had seen with their own eyes, the ways in which their own sisters and daughters and their mothers had been raped, didn't matter, hadn't happened. And you expect people who have undergone a war of extermination, had resisted, and then being told not only by the Ethiopian government, but by the world, including by the UN and the UN Human Rights Commission, to say, what you've been through is no different to anything else. And you expect them to behave well? I mean, it is precisely because it doesn't justify what they did, but it does explain it. Because we all know that where there is a culture of impunity, there are going to be revenge killings. There's going to be a cycle of violence. And at the current time, when the Tigrayans have withdrawn back to Tigray, they've done the thing that was demanded of them by the international community without
in fact, that was one of the questions I wanted to ask you.
Without even a withdrawal of Eritrean and Amhara forces from Western Tigray, without any international assistance of note going to Tigray. How do you expect that population and its political leadership to negotiate, to be expected to negotiate in good faith, to have the confidence in anybody except themselves in which they can entrust their future? Now, what we know from people who've undergone genocide, look at the Jews in Israel, look at the Tutsis in Rwanda, they will never entrust their security to anyone other than themselves. They will be deeply traumatized, deeply hurt, deeply distrustful, and with good reason. And so the first thing that needs to be done as a precondition for any reasonable, forward-thinking, productive dialogue among Ethiopians, including Tigrayans, and among the Tigrayans themselves, is to extend that hand of understanding, of sympathy and solidarity. And it is tragic, and it is not only wrong, but it is a terrible, terrible political blunder for the Ethiopian political class in power in Addis and the international community not to do that.
Thank you. In fact, one of the questions I was told to ask from several scholars were if you have any insight as to why the TDF retreated after almost reaching the capital and reversing one. I think you said the international community Uh, do you think the drones had an impact? Do you think the international, what if any, the international community's role and demand and precondition that they had let down for the TDF to withdraw back and prevent them from entering the capital? And the third is, do you think the political dynamics in Ethiopia, in which if the TPLF returns and enters the country, they may not be the situation might be worse than imagined. What do you attribute to their sudden withdrawal back into Tigray?
I don't know for sure, but I would say three things. One was that the military advances had gone way ahead of the political preparation, so that the Tigray Defense Forces were winning the war, but some of those in the TPLF leadership were not doing the political work to prepare the Ethiopian public to construct alliances, prepare the international community. They were just simply not doing that. So there was that political shortcoming. The second was there was enormous political pressure on them, and I don't know whether deals were made. I'm not aware of any, but certainly the United States gave them no material support at all, and in fact was consistently demanding they withdraw to Tigray. And the implication being, if you do that, then other things will follow. And I don't, as I say, I don't know whether there was a political deal on the table. If there was one, for sure, the number one item would have been humanitarian assistance, and that has not been happening. So, and then there were the drones. There was the fact that the force they were fighting was no longer Ethiopia. It was Turkey. It was the UAE, and the forces that they were providing. And drones, as we've seen elsewhere in Azerbaijan, in Libya, can be an extremely lethal battlefield weapon, and it made it very, very difficult for the Tigrayans to sustain their advance.
I think that makes sense. I want to actually, a related question is, in fact, in your article you state that the Oromos and the Tigrayans have something in common, that is to finish the empire, to, and in other words, to transform the empires. Ideologically, I think the Oromos and the Tigrayans have similar ideology. One, the fact that the constitution, the multinational constitution, was drafted in collaboration. The current constitution that we have, the fact that the Tigrayans at the moment against centralized governance, and the fact that in the future both the Oromos and the Tigrayans willing to live in a federated state rather than a centralized state. Do you think this partnership or alliance, given what we have seen, because in the last 27 years, the multinational federalism have brought a tremendous hope, as you also said it, that multinational federalism was keeping together instead of, at the moment, Ethiopia was on the brink of disintegrating into pieces. In the way you were framing it, and the way OSA scholars also were saying, this multinational federalism actually kept Ethiopia united by providing, at least symbolically providing, each and every one, recognizing that, like, we have 83 or so ethnic groups, at least predominantly giving them homeland where they can express, revive their culture and everything. Do you think then that, how do you foresee this alliance if they were to jointly fight and decentralize the state and, you know, transform the empire?
Several points. First of all, Ethiopia, and especially some members of the sort of particularly the Amhara and the Shoan educated ruling elite class, need to come to terms with the realities of the imperial past. And there needs to be that sort of decolonization of the de-imperialization of the political space. And actually I was really quite shocked over the last few years to see how strongly that discourse came back.
We were surprised as well with what we had in 1974.
Yeah. The second point is that the ethno-federal system had some very serious problems. It had some problems in its conceptualization and problems in its implementation. The problems of implementation are easy to see, in that the cultural and linguistic rights were granted, but actually the system remained really very centralized, basically everyone blames TPLF, but it wasn't just TPLF. Actually, it was it was centralized, with TPLF, the Amharas and the LPDO, who actually had a lot of power, but it was not democratized, and that was its big failing. And as we said, we were discussing at the beginning, the theory of democracy of the developmental state was democracy, not yet, and it was postponed for too long. It should have been. There should have been an accommodation, and I think there was a realization by Jawar and others who led that movement of the fragility of the state, of the need to accommodate those already in power with democracy, to have, as it were, a managed transition rather than a sudden revolutionary process. And then we have the challenge of really where we take it from here, because the current situation is that that Abiy has sort of normalized the political system based upon some horrendous crimes, real international crimes, but also political crimes that have been committed over the last couple of years. So it's not going to be good enough to have a national dialogue and a liberalization, starting with the current situation as the status quo, the point of departure, and saying let's work within those confines. We've had an election. Any other country in the world that had an election with 95% of the seats going to the incumbent party, that would be dismissed as a joke. It would not be called a landslide. When the EPRDF did that, it was legitimately dismissed as, this is not a legitimate democracy. Same with the PP. We cannot simply say, oh, Abiy has been elected and therefore we need to operate on that basis. We cannot say that certain political parties that were ruled out of the political sphere over the last couple of years, we can allow them back in, but only as supplicants. There needs to be a much more fundamental reappraisal. And when that reappraisal happens, it also needs to examine, I think, some of the basic problems with the ethno-federal system. Because it is very hard, in fact, it's impossible to draw firm lines around ethnic groups, to have those boundaries as impermeable. And one of the problems that arose, of course, as Ethiopia was developing fast, was that the ethnic boundaries no longer made social or economic sense. There were people who wanted to migrate. There were cities that needed to grow. And the reality of any country, of any nation, is that identities change as history moves on, as the politics and economics and society changes. And there needs to be some flexibility built into the design the future constitutional system that will allow allow identities to breathe, allow people to mix, allow new identities to emerge, rather than fossilizing them or simply drawing lines based upon particular patterns of agrarian settlement as they existed in the past. So we need, I think, a period of really quite creative dialogue, rather than rushing to a once and for all political settlement.
Yes, absolutely. I think let me make some cases for the multinational federalism. I think one of the components that is not looked seriously is, absolutely agree with you, the boundaries kind of drawn on the basis of ethnicity or linguistic. What this multinational federalism does actually, it attempts to diversify the bureaucracy of Ethiopia. And that has been the biggest problem in Ethiopia. Despite change in government, the bureaucracy remained intact. The bureaucracy remained in the hands of one ethnic group predominantly. In fact, we can cite examples even during the TPLF, the APRDF's rule, over 60% of the bureaucracy was in the hands of one ethnic group. 85% of the media, Ethiopian media, was in the hand of one group, even at that time. And when you look at international relations, it's also the same, predominantly filled by one ethnic group. So one of the things that this multinational federalism will do down the road is to diversify the opportunities within the bureaucracy. And it's not just simply the language or having certain groups here and there or having an election or regional state, but the key important areas have been, the majority of Ethiopian nationalities have been excluded from fair. And that's why even in the West, we see a single narrative emerging. In fact, when we see it here, and one of the things I would like to get in with you is that, for instance, this war predominantly, the majority of ethnic nationalities do not support this war. Never want this war. It's probably predominantly led by one ethnic group who have the voice in the bureaucracy, who have control of the media, who have access to international relations. And the rest of Ethiopian people are basically, their voice are not heard. So this multinational federalism, although it has not been, as we said, has not been implemented, has not been democratized, what it actually was attempting to do, what it maybe was intended or unintended, but actually it's about diversifying this bureaucracy. I think that's the key issue now. I think that the current attempt to rearrange this, do you foresee a danger in this, returning back to the centralized state, the previous geographical configuration that they had?
I think the best advertisement for the ethno-federal system is its enemies, if you like. If we could go back 3 years, there were, I think, many opportunities for revisiting how the system was structured. Issues like those you've mentioned, the staffing of the bureaucracy, the control over the media, they could have been democratized in a manner that also addressed some of the most contentious issues, like the boundaries of Addis Ababa, in ways that both met the developmental needs of the nation as a whole, and also the specific rights and legitimate democratic demands of groups such as the Oromo. It's going to be much more difficult now. now there is so much polarization, so much ethnic animosity, and that that dream of an empire has been revived, and there are very powerful constituencies now with external friends like Eritrea and some of the external backers that want to want to turn the clock even further back and actually dismantle so many of those gains that were made under the federal system. So it's going to be hugely more difficult now because of the animosity, the grievances, the violence, the distrust, and the fact that people have lost confidence in a future, a common future of prosperity. Because the one thing that the EPRDF did manage to do was to make people actually believe, yes, this country is developing, and all the things of which Abiy and his followers are so proud, the dams, the railroads, etc. They didn't build any of those.
Right.
They can't claim credit for any of that. So and in order to get these these developmental trajectory back, which has to be the basis for some compact about Ethiopians coming together, it's going to be very, very difficult.
Right, and I think that is the key here. One of the difficult issues, challenges that we're facing is the largest majority of Ethiopians want democracy, to live under democratic governance, and that voice is not being heard. And for instance, even prior to Oromos being incorporated into the Ethiopian Empire, they had a democratic system that was fair and balanced. And even the Oromos, by the time the conquest occurred, they were living under a federal state. They had an assembly, they had an election. And if the West is seriously committed to democracy and stabilizing the region, would it be important to consider this larger majority? Some scholars even call the southern nation, including the Oromos, the oppressed majority, to include them. And so far what we have seen is northern-centric approach in terms of scholarship, in terms of policies. Do you see this challenge, and how do if we're serious about bringing peace and stability in the region, how do we get this point across? Because it doesn't take much process for Oromos to develop, adapt democracy, because the foundation, the prerequisite structures are already ingrained in the mind of the Oromo people. This is the challenge that we're having. How have you experienced that? How do we overcome such challenge?
I think it's I think there are a number of challenges that are all bound up together here. One is it's very easy for foreign politicians, diplomats, statesmen to confuse a government and a state, and to think we want stability, therefore we want the current government to be protected, preserved, not to fall. Now, unfortunately, what we have in Ethiopia today is a government that is actually been dismantling the state over which it presides. And so actually keeping this type of government, it doesn't, I mean, the individuals who are leading it aren't really important, but a very transactional, mercenary form of government.
Right.
Keeping that is actually a recipe for instability, not for stability. That, I think, has to be recognized. There's going to be a very particular challenge with Tigray, which we mentioned, which is Tigray is going to need its own some special treatment, not because they're special people, but because of what they have been through Any people that has faced a campaign of extermination needs to be treated in a special way. There's also the matter of the numerous minorities, and there, of course, there are, as you said, more than 80 ethnic groups, and many of these groups would fear the domination of a state by any one of the major blocs. They're fearful of the Amhara and especially those Amhara leaders who want to return to an empire, but they also would be fearful of a state dominated by the Oromo, simply because of the demographic weight and the potential political and economic weight of the Oromo, where they to be to dominate the state, and so guarantees for all those other groups are also essentially part of it. But I think there's a key point also, which is one that you allude to, which is that so much of the debate about Ethiopia and the political contestation has been about the Northern Highlands. It's about being Tigray versus Amhara. The historic stereotype being the Amhara have the empire, the Tigrayans wanted to rule the country but pretend it wasn't an empire, and therefore have various cosmetic things to call it a federation. The real challenge, which the Tigrayans went some way towards addressing, but not far enough, was what does it mean actually to dismantle an imperial system with all the inbuilt structural historical biases that system has, that empower certain groups at the expense of others. And how is the country to be reinvented in a manner that it can really be a nation of nations? And that, unfortunately, there aren't very good models for this. The Yugoslav experience, and Yugoslav was not an empire; it was a multinational state, but not an empire. The Serbs were the dominant entity there, but they were not imperial in a comparable way. Is not a good. The Russian Empire is perhaps more comparable, but that has not had a good outcome either. So some level of really creative thinking is required, and here I think we can turn to some of the scholars of international public law and conflict resolution who talk about the formalized political unsettlement. And the core of that idea is that you do not want to, is when you have groups, communities that have political differences that cannot easily be reconciled, but nonetheless need to live together. You come with a formula that allows them to coexist despite these unresolved differences, in the anticipation, the hope that they will be able to develop new mechanisms and new circumstances will arise that allow them to live together. So a good example is Northern Ireland, excuse me, where the key differences between the Catholics and the Protestants, the Loyalists, the Republicans and the Loyalists, were not resolved in the Good Friday Agreement, but they were, a formula was arrived at that allowed them to live together in the context of, in that case, the European Union, meaning that the boundary between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland didn't become meaningful. And so all sorts of other formulations were possible. So I think Ethiopians need to think about exploring how you can formalize political constitutional arrangements that allow for coexistence and continuing dialogue and evolution. I think it's a mistake to try and rush to a final political settlement in a short period of time.
Currently, the Abiy administration is been floating around a national reconciliation or a national dialogue in the country, but the specifics are yet to come, or how serious They are yet to be presented to the public. If this national dialogue were to go forward, what are the component or the structural, the basic thing that is necessary for this national dialogue to be viable, to at least bear some fruit?
I think crucially important is that it should have a neutral, impartial, credible chair. And also that every constituency needs to be represented on equal terms. I think if it were to be led by and controlled by Abiy, it's not going to be credible. Let's face it. He is going to be using every trick in the book to manipulate it. And I think the internationals who have been enthusiastic about it should therefore, if he insists on leading it, should stay away. Should say this is not the national dialogue that we need.
Do you foresee, as of right now, the so-called national dialogue excludes the TDF, the Oromo Liberation Army, and some other people? Do you think having a national dialogue without the Tigrayans or Oromo freedom fighters, Ola, or major other group would bear some fruit, or is this just a publicity stunt for the international community?
There is there's a basic principle about peace and reconciliation, which is you make peace with your enemies. Mm-hmm. And it's only by recognizing your enemies and talking to them that you can make peace and have a national dialogue. So if groups are to be excluded on that basis, then it doesn't make sense. By the same token, it does not make sense for the OLA or the TPLF to want to exclude Abiy. He is there. He is clearly a political player with a constituency and some very loyal and fervent followers. So Ethiopians who are currently enemies need to come together and talk. And I think a key step for that is that the current social media environment, which is so toxic, which does not allow for the type of reasoned, open debate that is necessary, that needs to change. And the social media companies need urgently to alter their algorithms in order to promote rather than demote any consensus building talk, and really to rule out hate speech. We're all in favor of freedom of speech, but it is absolutely not okay to abuse freedom of speech in order to incite violence, to use dehumanizing language and rhetoric to invoke ethnic hatred. That is not what free speech
is all about. Absolutely. In fact, many scholars like you, and even in Ethiopia, those who are critics of the country, their names smeared, their credentials been attacked, and they have exported such extremist approach to dealing to America. And I have seen many individual credible scholars, diplomats who have come under attack because they have different opinion, different views. This attack on intellectualism, we have seen it, and I've seen a petition floating around, in fact, about you, because you deviate from the narrative of the extremist group and actually try to offer some kind of a balanced idea. And this type of culture of attacking intellectuals is very dangerous. And while you're in America enjoying the fruits of America, the value that democracy offers you, and yet you use that democracy to attack. And do you see this group transforming or bringing democratic value to Ethiopia. If they act this way in a democratic country, imagine what the future of Ethiopia will hold if this group actually take the center stage of Ethiopia.
No, I think, I mean, everyone has legitimate views that can be expressed, but I think it's the idea, the type of orchestrated, disinformation, polarization that is so prevalent today, and it is asymmetric. I mean, they do, the government accuses the Tigrayans and the Oromo opposition of having a propaganda campaign. They actually, especially the Tigrayans, the TPLF has the most inept propaganda campaign you can imagine. There are people in the diaspora who are much more skilled and effective, but there is no organized propaganda on that side. Whereas on the government side, they're clearly spending vast amounts of money and have employed companies that are very skilled at the type of social media disinformation that we have seen, most notably in South Asia. They're using very, very similar techniques and tactics to try and close down debate, to intimidate their critics, or just to tie up their critics in all sorts of time-wasting activities of having to explain to their institutions what they're doing and so on. It's sadly that those types of tactics can be quite effective, but they're effective at the price of killing off the type of scholarship, the type of journalism, the type of debate that is so essential for the future of the country.
Let me just say, I did a little research on a group who have initiated a petition against you. It looks like it's a group that opened a website probably about not too long ago. It was purposely done to attack you. They created some kind of website, and let me just say, we don't endorse that, and we're against that, and we celebrate scholarship, intellectuals. Even if we disagree on an ideas, we're okay with it. And so I just want the listeners and Oromo scholars to lend you some support, because it's not just you, it's democracy that's at the stake. Because if you can't speak, if you can't write, if you can't be critical of the government, then there is no democracy. Even that is what democracy is all about. So I'm ashamed that some group of my country is able to do that, to get their way in, when they could come on the stage, discuss issues with you openly, and instead they use backward channels to do that. And so I'm ashamed, but we are behind you for all the work that you have done. You are incredible scholars. I know I've kept you for so long, but the question that many Oromo people have been intrigued is those two questions. And that is, you state in your article, by the way, that is an article that we are going to comb through, because it's also Oromo Studies Association have produced such an idea, and it has similar ideas that we were entertaining in this group for a very long time. And in fact, there was debate in this group, in the scholarly group, the role of Oromo in Ethiopia. In this article, you state that the Oromo have the state at their feet. If you could explain that, and then they have it for quite a while to determine the political settlement for generations to come. And we are intrigued, Western scholars actually coming at this type of conclusion, because it was rare. There are Western scholars who study the southern nations and the Oromos, but the way you articulated intrigued our interest. Uh, could you elaborate a little bit on that? What you meant by it?
Well, that article was written a couple of months ago
Hmm.
when the Tigray Defense Forces and the Oromo Liberation Army were, it appeared unstoppable. They were stopped
Right.
by Turkish and Emirati drones, as it happened, and by an international consensus that included the United States, that Abiy's government should be protected.
Hmm.
The My view at that moment was that a united political position across the spectrum of the Oromo leadership
Hmm.
would have forced a change, and I would have expected the Tigrayans to have fallen in support of such a position.
Right.
There is still that opportunity. The military situation has changed, but the political precarity of the government in Addis Ababa, a government really in name only, has not changed. It is still it is essentially bankrupt. It still does not have an army. It is dependent upon the goodwill of a number of foreign countries, and there is an absence of a cohesive, energetic political project that actually projects a new future for Ethiopia. And there was such a project gestating just a couple of years ago, and it reflected the organization and the aspiration of the Oromo people as a whole. And if that were to be re-energized at this point, I think there would be a democratic opening and momentum that I think would be irresistible.
Absolutely. And I think I would agree with you. And one of the challenges that we are actually facing is to get the attention of the policymakers in the West to look at the Oromos very seriously, because Oromos' commitment to democracy and federalism is not just a rhetoric, but it's a real thing. They're committed to democracy. They abhor centralized strong figure. They follow the system. And the prime example was the Oromo protest, the Kero protest that took place and from 2016 to 2018. It is, for when you look at it, it's historical event. And in a country that never had um, ruled by military juntas for a very long time, for Oromos to organize, in fact, fight for the implementation, for the protection of the Constitution and advance that. And those leaders, yet committed to democracy, willingly, instead of giving up on democracy, were jailed, imprisoned, and many of the Keros have died. And so the challenge is, if the West is really serious in the region, it needs to take into account the Southern nation nationalities, because the most productive part of Ethiopia is that. The most populated part of Ethiopia is that. The democratic values, not only of the Oromos, even the other Southern nation nationalities, to entertain this decentralized approach way of life. And I think Oromos, as you said in the question, and I actually agree with it. In many, we have been having this debate that you raised. Oromos have had the state at their feet, not only now, even before. One of the challenges we had is getting the international community's attention, because, as you've articulated, also Ethiopia is a construct of international community. Without international community, this empire would not continue this long. In our analysis, as you have also said. In fact, the recent intervention is clearly demonstrates that. The fact that Turkey, China, Russia have intervened to keep the central power to live another day is indicative that, and similar things have taken place in Ethiopia prior to this. And I think in our analysis, what we see, the West would, especially America, would benefit at least from a democratized Ethiopia, from stable Ethiopia, rather than what we've seen. And America have always dealt with the North, and the result has always been the same. There's a promise of democracy. 10 or 15 years later, it collapses because there's no foundation and tradition to support that. There isn't a philosophical ground except to hold election. Outside that, you hold election every 4 years. The rest of the time, you're back to authoritarian governance. On the other hand, I think Oromos have a lot to offer, not only to Ethiopians, but to the Horn of Africa. And so our challenge is that how do we craft this message to scholars like you? We want to reach scholars like you. The fight of democracy is serious. We want someone who's committed, and we want to build this kind of partnership. And democracy is vital in our view. In fact, and I think, and I'll stop at this. Many people in Africa look to the United States as a beacon of democracy. I understand there were many interventions that failed. There's many criticism against America. But the African nation is always, the youth especially, is always looking to the ideals of America. And the majority of Ethiopians want democracy. They differ. They're upset the fact that the current administration have isolated the West and bowed to the East. And that's our challenge. How do we get over that? What is it? How do we build a stronger democratic partner internationally?
I think absolutely. I think the challenge is really to build an Ethiopian democracy. And as you indicate, there are strong traditions of democracy and decentralization in Ethiopia. Ethiopia doesn't need to look to the West, doesn't need to look to Europe or America, doesn't need to turn its back on Asia. Ethiopia can find those traditions on its own, but it needs to be not just slogans. It needs to be an authentic practice grounded in the norms, principles, and institutions that are appropriate to Ethiopia. And one of the tragedies, of course, is that the African Union has espoused many of those values, and the current Ethiopian government has really turned its back on the last 20 or so years of progress in developing and entrenching those African democratic norms.
Thank you. And this is the last question I have, and I appreciate for being generous with your time. The title of your article, What's Next for Ethiopia? Take your time. What do you see? What do you envision? What are some scenarios do you entertain at night or theorize? What is really next for this country?
Well, my nightmare scenario is that Ethiopia continues down its current track of becoming one of the parts of the security perimeter of the Middle East, under the heel of Eritrea, destabilized, impoverished, with locked in a cycle of perpetual disagreement and conflict. There's a slightly better scenario in which it looks something more like Congo or Nigeria, which is I think that direction in which it probably was headed prior to the war against Tigray. But there is, I think, in Ethiopia enough of a commitment to real values of tolerance, of dialogue, of democracy, that Ethiopians can pull themselves back from the brink. But that requires first of all, the not being ashamed to denounce violence and hatred, and not being ashamed to stand for peace and dialogue, and to listen to one another, and in the best tradition, sit and talk these issues out over really quite a long period of time, in the spirit of patience and humility.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this. This has been very insightful. I know I got thousands of questions. I hope in the future we will come back and revisit this issue. One thing that also the Oromo Studies Association is interested is to look forward and examine the mechanism of famine, which you have written a book, and maybe down the road examine the role of money in the Horn of Africa. And when I glanced through your book on that, recently I had spoken with the Sudanese expert who had led the civilian peaceful movement, and the parallel, how that revolution has been hijacked, the parallel to Oromo protest, you could say it's an exact replica. And it's amazing, and so we would like to in the future invite you back at least to speak on famine, whether it's man-made or not. I really appreciate you. Thank you for your contribution to Ethiopia. Thank you for standing with us, with the people, and for fighting for democracy. Professor Alex Duval, thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.